before we get back to CES, I think we should mention Aaron Swartz. What an interesting fellow. Teen prodigy. If you read Cory Doctorow on Boing Boing, had a very touching, heartfelt eulogy for Aaron. Larry Lessig, who knew Aaron, had a very touching eulogy. Everybody seemed to know this kid, starting with around the age of 14, when he started showing up at computer conferences and trade shows. He was right about that age when he helped write the specification for RSS, which we use every day. That's how we do podcasts. He wrote some of the early code for Reddit and sold the code to Reddit. And he's sometimes called a founder. I don't think that's quite accurate, but he certainly wrote much of the code that Reddit's running. And he became a political activist in a very interesting way. Larry Lessig wrote, "He was brilliant and funny, a kid genius, a soul, a conscience, the source of a question I've asked myself a million times. What would Aaron think?" This is Larry Lessig, the Harvard constitutional law professor. Unfortunately, Aaron committed suicide, killed himself on Friday at the age of 26. And Larry Lessig and many others, including the family, blame the U.S. government. Larry says, "That person has gone today driven to the edge by what a decent society would only call bullying. I get wrong, but I also get proportionality. And if you don't get both, you don't deserve to have the power of the United States government behind you." Here's what happened. Aaron believed, like all hackers, that information wants to be free. There's a video of Aaron speaking. He started freeing information early on. It's interesting. He liberated the U.S. legal code. So there's a system called PACER that gives you, in the United States, gives us access to case law, paid access to case law. Now, case law is public domain. Case law is what all the courts have ruled about stuff. It's what you would use if you were defending yourself, what the precedents, what the legal precedents are. And, every lawyer has a law library, but then they also go online to PACER. And for a fee, they download these judgments. But those judgments belong to all of us. They're public domain. They're the U.S. courts. So activists built something called Recap and encouraged its users to take their case law downloads after they did it and post them on Recap. Perfectly legal, because it's our stuff. And Recap was free and open, and anybody can use it. Well, Aaron took some of the money he made from the sale of Reddit and bought 20% of the PACER content and posted it on Recap. That's a guy who believes information should be free. He got in trouble with the feds. The FBI investigated him. Cory Doctorow says it looked like he'd be on the pointy end of some bad legal stuff, but he escaped it all and emerged triumphant. Because, in fact, he didn't break any laws. There wasn't nothing he could do. But he did raise the ire of the United States federal law enforcement.
He annoyed a lot of people doing that.
He annoyed people. He founded a group called Demand Progress, which was one of the real effective groups of fighting SOPA and PIPA last year. So he might have, I don't know, he did something that was a little reckless, let's say. There is another database, kind of like the PACER database. It's called JSTOR. It's an academic journal database, and it charges money for access to academic journals. Now, these aren't quite exactly the public domain. Some of these studies were paid for by federal funds. Some of the studies are academic and paid for by universities. But it's often been a bone of contention that this stuff, for society's sake, should be widely available. The scientific journals, anybody should be able to access them, shouldn't have to pay for it. He was associated with Harvard. Harvard had an account with JSTOR. He used his legitimate account, but he did something JSTOR says you can't do, which is download in bulk. He, in fact, took a laptop, snuck it into MIT, put it in the closet in MIT, and had
it in the closet
and downloaded the entire database.
I think 20%.
Is it that little? I thought it was more. Anyway, gigabytes.
No, he took all of it.
It's a lot. I don't know how much.
Yes, he took a lot.
JSTOR, when they caught him, actually he turned himself in. JSTOR and MIT decided to prosecute. The feds, of course, said, "Yeah, we finally got this kid." Eventually, JSTOR backed down. And in fact, an interesting thing, JSTOR just a few weeks ago decided to make all of that information public anyway. MIT, according to Lessig, was a little less little more equivocal in its backing down, giving the prosecutors, the federal prosecutors, sufficient reason to continue forward. Aaron was facing 50 years in jail, a $4 million fine. Trial was to come in April. Now,
Totally disproportionate.
totally disproportionate. They were treating him like a terrorist.
They're trying to make an example out of him.
They implied that he was stealing this data to sell it, which he wasn't. He wanted to make it publicly available. However, he did break laws. Although,
just not really 50 years worth.
Not
of
50.
laws.
Yeah. Now, Corey writes, Aaron was a person who had problems with depression for many years. He'd written about the subject publicly, talked about it with his friends. And, of course, there are many things that might cause a person to want to take his own life. But his friends, his family, and Larry Lessig do think that the unreasonable, disproportionate reaction of the federal government had something to do with it. The thought of being in prison for 50 years might have had something to do with it. So our deepest condolences to all who knew Aaron Swartz, to his family, to his partner. It is just a horrible tragedy. I don't think that it's really appropriate to say it's all the Fed's fault, but it's certainly appropriate to shine a light on their inappropriate prosecution. And I think it's a great loss for all of us. It's very sad.
I think one of the things we can take away, and there are an interesting couple of things that are happening. So academics are starting to post PDFs of some of their material and open sourcing it and putting it on Twitter so that it's sort of like a tribute to, make some information free. But I think one of the other things that we can really take away from this is, on like kind of a serious and slightly grim note, is that mental health and depression is something that affects a lot of people. It affects a lot of people in the kind of geek and nerd community. Many of us kind of, you laugh it off as being a little bit, I'm a bit antisocial because I'm a bit of a geek. But I think we all have a little bit of responsibility just to try and look after the people that are near us and try and try and get people to get help if they need it.
Now, Larry points out that Aaron had many friends in San Francisco, and he was beloved by many. He was not, somebody who was cut off from society. So I don't want to even speculate on what happened. The expert witness who was going to testify on his behalf, Alex Stamos, who was a computer security and forensic experts, called the case vindictive. He said that Aaron did not hack the JSTOR website. He just wrote, for any reasonable definition of hack, he wrote a handful of basic Python scripts that discovered the URLs of articles, then used curl to request them. He did not use parameter tampering. He did not break a CAPTCHA. He did not, do anything sneaky. He did not cover his tracks or hide his activity. The government provided no evidence that these downloads caused a negative effect on either JSTOR or MIT. It's very sad.
But beyond the tragedy of losing someone who was so intelligent, who was a visionary, who was actually fighting for the free information rights of anyone who's ever used an electronic resource, I think there's another story here, which is how desperate the DOJ and the federal government is to have some sort of strong case that establishes their version of copyright and property laws in the digital domain. We saw it with the defeat of SOPA and PIPA. We saw it with the bungled prosecution of Kim.com and Mega Upload, and we see it here.
Yeah.
And they're so desperate for a win that I think that's where that bully attitude comes into. We want to make an example out of it.
There's also a fear of technology that drives a little bit of this. I think some of the overreaction